And let me begin by welcoming you all to this conference, Proposition 13 at 30, which the Institute of Governmental Studies here at Berkeley is sponsoring in conjunction with UC San Diego's sociology department, represented by the person in the second row, Professor Isaac Martin, who really did all the work of putting together the program. I also want to thank the Irvine Foundation profusely for providing the wherewithal to enable us to do this on a first-class basis. I don't see Amy Dominguez-Arms here, the program officer at Irvine, but she may come in later on. But anyway, I want to thank the Irvine Foundation. And Stanford University Press has also helped us publicize this event and provided some support, and they hope that in return some of you will buy Isaac's new book on Proposition 13, which they just recently published. It's an excellent book, and several books will be around later on if anyone is interested in adding to their library. Finally, I want to thank, many of you have met them already, Mark Levin, the Assistant Director of IGS, and Janine Jackson, the Events Coordinator at IGS, who have done all the heavy lifting, including the lifting of these chairs to make it possible for us to proceed. So let me just say a few words, and then introduce Mark DiCamillo to make his very interesting presentation. D-Day, the 6th of June, the invasion of Normandy, 64 years ago. 30 years ago, California's version of D-Day, the passage of Proposition 13. I tried to think of what did D stand for in the context of the California event, and I think there are two distinct meanings of D among people who have studied Proposition 13. There's D for deliverance, and there's D for doom. And the deliverance party and the doom party formed very quickly after the passage of the event, and those factions remain entrenched in the discourse of Proposition 13 to this day, and I sense that both factions will be represented in the remarks that we're going to hear in the rest of the day. Take my own quick fix of some of the major consequences, I think undisputed consequences of Proposition 13, and you can decide for yourselves whether they're good, bad, or ugly. But it's pretty clear that when the Proposition 13 achieved its main goal, which was to lower property taxes and create tax certainty. That is to say, people now know pretty much what their property tax is going to be once they buy a home, and Proposition 13 protects homeowners against inflation. You get an inflation benefit given the way the proposition works. So that was the main goal of Proposition 13, and it was achieved. I think another purpose of the initiative, and perhaps Joel Fox will say more about this, was to reduce the size of government. I think in this, the best that can be said is Proposition 13 probably slowed to some extent the almost inexorable expansion of government in the modern era, but certainly government spending in California has continued to grow despite Proposition 13's constraint. I think a third important implication was that Proposition 13 essentially ushered in an era of plebiscitary government in California. From that day forward, any major policy decision, including in the fiscal domain, was made through the passage of an initiative or a constitutional amendment. So some version of the people, or the people as shaped and persuaded by interest groups behind these initiatives, took sway over elected officials in the legislature in particular. As a result, policies and taxes now have to be marketed and sold, and there is a very burgeoning industry of consultants and others who are making money in that particular enterprise. Finally, and I could say much more, but I don't want to cut into the valuable time of the real speakers here, Proposition 13 obviously changed the balance of power and changed the nature of the relationships between state and local governments in the fiscal domain, and this trickled down into other areas. And I think, in some sense, local government, the power of local government, the capacity of local government was one of the big losers in Proposition 13, and I doubt that that was intended. We can maybe hear more about this later. But I think what you will learn from Mark's remarks in the next minute or two, that it is a pretty safe bet to say that Proposition 13 is here for the foreseeable future. It is here to stay. It is politically pretty much untouchable, and looking at the gray hairs in the room, the gray hairs will never not see a different system. Some of the youngsters, who knows, predicting more that far ahead is kind of an unwise thing for political scientists to attempt. But Proposition 13 is entrenched in popular support. In many ways, I think, well, Mark can comment on this, that levels of support is as strong as it ever was. And so I think for California citizens, California elected officials, California administrators, their lives in making policy and implementing policy is going to continue to be constrained by the fiscal regime that Proposition 13 imposed. And with that, let me turn to a wonderful opportunity that we have, is to hear Mark DiCamillo talk in detail about the latest poll that the Field Institute has just published, has just released. Mark DiCamillo is the Senior Vice President of Field Research Corporation and Director of the Field Poll, which is, I think, one of the gold standards in our understanding of California public opinion for 50 years or longer. Mark succeeded Merv Field, who founded the poll. I'm sorry, Merv is not well enough to be here today, but together they provide a very, very valuable public resource. Mark is a cum laude graduate of Harvard University. He holds an MBA from Cornell University's Johnson School of Business. We've been reminiscing that we've been working on some of these polls together for virtually 30 years, and I want to say that Mark has been a devoted friend of the Institute of Governmental Studies and has given tirelessly of his time. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Mark DiCamillo. One small addendum, Mark is going to speak, and then he will entertain questions briefly from the floor. Thanks.
Okay, it was 30 years ago today. I'm driving across the United States, just finishing my graduate training from the East Coast. I'm in the middle of Kansas, and I'm listening to UPI radio, and I hear Mervyn Field on the radio proclaiming that a political earthquake has just struck California. And it was the passage of Prop 13, and Merv had just hired me. I was coming across the country to work for him, and as Jack was saying, one of the very first polls that I was involved in at Field Research 30 years ago had to do with the aftermath of Prop 13, looking at its implementation, its immediate effects, and so on. And we did work at the time with an associate professor who was very interested in this issue, Jack Citrin. And it's fitting that 30 years has passed, and here we are examining Prop 13 through the rearview mirror of 30 years of experience looking at this issue. Anyways, let me talk a little about the survey. This was a survey that was jointly conducted through the field poll and IGS. Jack was working with me, collaborating in the development of the questions. We started this process about 2 months ago. The survey itself, we polled 1,052 registered voters, although as you'll see, we split the sample to test variations in wording on a number of questions, and those sample sizes are about 500. We sampled randomly from statewide list of registered voters that was done by telephone, English and Spanish, both landline and cell phone, between May 17 and 26. We made up to six attempts to try to reach voters, and the results were just weighted slightly to make sure they're all in alignment with the voting population of California. The first question about Prop 13 that was included had to do with just voter familiarity with Prop 13, and you can see that voters split into three almost equal-sized groups. About a third of voters say they're very familiar with Prop 13, about a third say somewhat, and about a third say not too or not at all familiar. If you look at the very familiar segment, it's not surprising that homeowners are more familiar with it than renters, and that your length of residence in your current home is a big factor in its familiarity to voters. Okay, if Prop 13 were up for a vote again today, how would voters vote? You can see by a greater than 2-to-1 margin, 57 to 23, overwhelming support for Prop 13. The vote itself was 65-35, so this margin is actually a little higher if you factor out the 20% who don't give an opinion. You can look at support. Certainly, homeowners were always a big part of the passage of Prop 13. They contributed to the huge turnout of voters on Prop 13 back in 1978. They still are supporting it more, and if you owned your home at the time Prop 13 passed, you're overwhelmingly supportive. But what's interesting, I think, about this table, and there has been some discussion over the years that as the main beneficiaries of Prop 13, as they become a smaller segment of the voting population, those who've been in their homes for 20 or 30 years, maybe support for Prop 13 will start to diminish. Well, that's not the case. In fact, about half of all the homeowners that we interviewed bought their homes within the past 10 years. And so if you look at their support of that segment, which is where you might suspect that maybe there'd be less support for Prop 13, it's about the average of the statewide voting population. There's a majority supporting it, even among the more recent homeowners. We asked a series of questions that had to do with possible changes to Prop 13, provisions that would change some of its fundamental elements, and asked voters how they viewed those provisions. First, change Prop 13 by gradually raising the property taxes of longtime homeowners so that the amount they pay is more in line with the amount paid by recent buyers of similarly valued property. This is rejected more than 2-to-1, and what's more fascinating to me, again, are those recent home buyers for whom this kind of provision really wouldn't have much bite, at least not in the immediate present tense. Only 26% who bought their home in the past 10 years approve of that. So there's just not a call for that kind of change. Similarly, one of the big provisions of Prop 13 had to do with the fact that it limited the increase of property taxes to no more than 2% per year. Would you want to change that, allow your own local government the ability to increase property taxes by more than 2%? The answer is no, almost 5-to-1. There's very little appetite for this even among Democrats, renters, homeowners, it doesn't matter. What about changing Proposition 13 to enable the state legislature to increase taxes by a simple majority vote? Now, we asked this in two ways. One was just in a general way, straightforward question, and the other was reminding voters that the state is currently facing a budget deficit of between $14 and $20 billion. And then we asked the question. The answers that we got from the split samples were almost identical. I don't think these are statistically significant, the differences. About 7 in 10 voters say they disapprove of that idea. What about changing Proposition 13 by taxing residential and commercial properties at different rates? We had two versions of this question. One version, which is the more commonly viewed version, would be to increase the property taxes that are on commercial property so that they are taxed at a higher rate than residential properties. And the other is that let's just reduce the property taxes of residential property owners and make it a split roll that way. Well, if you reduce the property taxes of residential, voters like that idea. They get a big benefit, 61% to 28%. But the more realistic proposal, which is to split the roll and raise the property taxes of commercial property owners, is divided, 47-44. And when you look at the subgroups on this question, it's a very partisan result, as you might expect. 57% of Democrats support it, but just 36% of Republicans support it. So it is a divisive issue, pretty much on party lines. But it's the only reform in our survey where there is a slight plurality in favor of making a change. So it stands the best chance of a change. Okay, we also updated a number of measures that the field poll has asked in its history about taxes. And this is a question that we started back in 1977, prior to the passage of Prop 13, basically asking people, do you think state and local taxes are too high? And the questions, the categories were much too high, somewhat high, about right, or low. And here's the trend line. And you can see at the right, the current numbers, 61% saying that taxes are too high, is about the 31-year average. If you averaged all of the poll measures across this period, it's at about that level. And if you look at the past 7 or 8 years in the decade of the 2000s, it's about where it's been for the last 7 years. There hasn't been a lot of change on this general attitude of taxation. If you look at some of the subgroups on this general question, you can see 34% of voters are saying taxes are much too high, 27% somewhat high, 61% is the total. Republicans are more likely to feel that way. That's not a surprise, but I think when you think about taxes, most voters or most politicians or observers might think, well, Democrats are not as critical of the level of taxes. Well, that's not exactly true. A majority of Democrats think taxes in California, state and local taxes, are too high. They're joined by nonpartisans as well. And there's not a lot of difference by income on that question. There's another interesting trend question that we've asked first in 1977, and we've asked intermittently over the past 30 years. We asked voters to volunteer in their own words, what specific state and local taxes do they think is too high? Okay, look back in 1977. There was a clear message and a clear opportunity, if you were just reading the polls, that the problem in taxation in California back in 1977 was clearly property taxes. 60% back then volunteered this as the tax that came to mind as being too high. Now let's look across the years back to now to the present. There's no one single tax that just jumps out when you ask this question, but what's interesting is that, to me, property taxes, even though we have had the benefit of Prop 13, are still rated in the top 3. It's basically a kind of a statistical tie, really, with gasoline taxes, property taxes, and state income taxes coming to mind first as the state and local tax that's too high. I find that very interesting. Certainly gasoline taxes, I think the public has a sensitivity to gasoline price increases, and so anything touching gasoline is a problem today. But property taxes, when you look at who's saying this, the 29% who volunteer property taxes, it's mostly those new homeowners who just came into the market in the last 10 years, because if you look at the rate or the amount that they're paying for their homes and the values that we currently have, they're paying pretty high property taxes, so that's what comes to their mind, and they're dragging this number higher. But it's interesting that, it's mentioned slightly more than the state income tax, and the sales tax is in fourth, a little bit back, and then no other state or local tax is mentioned by more than 9% in that setting. Okay, we asked the question that we've asked from time to time, but here we split the sample again about the size of government. Should state and local governments provide more or fewer services to the public? If you ask it in the abstract, with no mention of its possible effect on taxes, they say yes, 61% to 30%. Not a big surprise, I suppose, but if you change the wording of the question to remind voters that more services, even if this means raising your taxes and fees, or fewer services if this means that your taxes and fees will be kept at or below current levels, you get a much more divided public. And what happens here is that the support of Democrats, which on the chart on the left was at 79% more government, goes down to 56%. So a big slug of Democrats say, well, not so fast, don't start raising my taxes. Republicans were never in support of more government services on either question. 31% on the one on the left, 23% on the one on the right. Nonpartisans also, big change from 68% support down to 51%. So the impact that potential increases of taxes has really affects voters' views of the size of government and government services. Should the state current deficit be dealt with mostly through spending cuts or mostly through tax increases? Public says mostly spending cuts, 63%. It's a view that is shared by a very large majority of Republicans, but even a plurality of Democrats and a solid majority of nonpartisans holds that view that when you're going after the deficit, make sure that you do it mostly through spending cuts. Okay, here's an interesting one. Agree, disagree. This is almost verbatim. The state can provide roughly the same level of services that it currently does, even if its budget has to be cut by $14 to $20 billion. Yes, the public says. 66%, 33% feel that way strongly. Most of them are Republicans, but even majorities of Democrats and nonpartisans hold to that view, that it's waste, fraud, inefficiencies, just cut away that, we can have our cake and eat it too. But in the end, independent of your own opinion about taxation, will the state end up resolving its current budget deficit with or without an increase in taxes? People are expecting what's coming. 81% say with tax increases, there's no difference across party lines in that expectation. Okay, let's talk about some spending cutting areas. And what we did in Jack's series, we actually posed 5 separate categories of state spending. So they had these 5 to choose from. Which one of these areas would you want to cut spending to avoid a tax increase? That's the way it was worded on the left. And then which one would you want to, shouldn't be cut, even if this means a tax increase? And you can see what the voters' response is. Prisons and corrections is the most popular area for cutting spending to avoid a tax increase. 47% choose that category. Then comes 23% at public assistance programs. UC can feel a little proud or good of the fact that only 8% said higher education in that realm, 5% the schools, and 4% health care programs. So those seem to be the more popular, untouchable areas, but they also are the largest areas of spending in the state budget. But on the right, which ones shouldn't be cut? Again, it's a reversal. You see the public schools mentioned first, 37%, followed by healthcare programs at 25%, and then higher education. Now, if you looked at some of the subgroups on that, it's interesting that when you look at prisons and corrections, it's mostly Democrats who say cut that, 55%. Only a third of Republicans are volunteering that, whereas Republicans are more supportive of cutting public assistance programs, about 3 times as likely as Democrats as reporting that. Okay, a general question on the willingness of voters to increase state taxes, income taxes, by 1% to avoid serious cutbacks in services. Not so much. 50% are not willing, 42% are willing, although most of the drag on this question comes from Republicans. There is a majority of support among Democrats and a plurality among nonpartisans. Not a lot of difference by income category in relation to the income tax hike. Okay, some other questions that we put on the survey were kind of hypothetical questions and trade-off questions. I found these very interesting. We've never done this before. First, a general question, the willingness of voters to accept larger K-12 class sizes if this meant that taxes could be kept at current levels. No, they don't want larger public school class sizes. 37% are willing, although a plurality of Republicans, 49%, is willing. Democrats and nonpartisans are against that idea. Okay, here's some trade-off questions. A willingness to pay an additional amount of money. We pose 2 different amounts, $100 or $200 per year in taxes, if this meant that the average K-12 school sizes would be reduced. So giving more money to the schools to avoid any increase and actually reducing class sizes. That is supported both at the $100 level and at the $200 level, although you can see slightly declining majority at the $200 level. Same kind of question about the willingness to allow the early release of up to 50,000 nonviolent prisoners from state prisons if this kept your taxes from going up $100 or $200. And you can see that to avoid a $100 increase, 56% are willing. To avoid a $200 increase, 62% are willing. Willingness to pay an additional amount of money, $100 or $200 per year in taxes, if this meant not releasing up to 50,000 nonviolent prisoners, not so much. 42% would be willing to pay the additional $100, 32% willing to pay the additional $200. Okay, that is the conclusion of the poll findings. I would just offer one general observation, and then I can open it up for questions. My general observation is that there is a strong vein of fiscal conservatism throughout this entire question set. It's obvious that there's strong support, continuing support for Prop 13, and there's very little appetite for making significant changes, at least from the voters' perspective, for most of its major provisions. But I also want to remind you, and especially for people who are here maybe from the East Coast or just observing California and not living it like we all do, is that these voters in this survey were the same voters who also said, for the first time in 25 years, that they would allow same-sex marriage in California. 51% of these same voters said they are now ready to accept allowing marriages between same-sex couples. And that's a big change over the 25 years we've been tracking polling on this question. And also, in the same survey, when we asked voters about who they're going to support in the upcoming election, Barack Obama was favored over John McCain by 17 points. So it's an interesting mix that we see here in California. I think we all recognize it, but it's not fully recognized that it's a fiscally conservative state, but socially tolerant, and right now, at least in general presidential politics, looking for a change. Thank you very much.
We have a good chunk of time for questions for Mark, and before I just want to an observation of my own here. 1985, David Sears of UCLA and I published our book called Tax Revolt, Something for Nothing in California, and the something for nothing phrase was designed to encapsulate this seemingly inconsistent mix of opinions where people were hostile to taxes, didn't want to pay any more taxes, but yet had a strong desire to maintain or expand the services that were available to them. And of course, students of public opinion more generally have come to understand that to expect the ordinary citizen to have highly constrained, highly coherent packages of opinions that cut across all different issues is just naive. What we have are sort of diversity, fragmentation, and sort of globules of opinions that sometimes hit each other and sometimes float by each other, and this seems to confirm that sort of general picture, which gives people trying to shape public opinion, influence public opinion, an opportunity by focusing attention on particular themes, framing issues in a particular way, and then trying to move opinion through those kinds of maneuvers. But now the floor is open, and I see Dan Walters had his hand up. So,
is it on? Please speak directly into the mic for questions.
Mark, your survey was of a registered voter pool rather than a likely voter.
These are total registered voters.
Would you not expect, given the characteristics of likely voters, that anti-tax strain that you found would probably be more pronounced among actual people who actually showed up at the polls or cast absentee ballots?
Depending on what election, the definition of likely voters changes all around. I mean, the definition of who just voted in this week's election was a very tiny cut of all registered voters. I think it was a turnout of about a quarter. But the definition of likely voters in a presidential election, which is coming up, it's probably going to be about 75 or 80% of all of these people are part of that. So depends. I mean, if you're looking at a small turnout primary, you're absolutely right. More homeowners, more older folks, so those subgroups have a bigger sway on the overall results. But if you're looking at the general election that's coming up, I think it's probably going to be as big a cross-section of voters as we will see. So it'll be interesting in that setting, how voters are reacting to the same-sex marriage amendment that's coming up. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I have two questions. The first question is that one of the variables you had there was, would you support a tax increase in order to balance the budget? And something like 61% said yes. And I didn't know whether or not you had discussed the governor's proposal that they may need to increase the sales tax, and whether or not that would have biased that answer. Question one. Question two, I was a little troubled by your income categories with, 20, 40, and 80, in that if you think about the median family income in some of our major coastal cities, it's above 80. So I'm just wondering how your actual sample divided up according to those three income categories.
Well, certainly we could have broken out the income categories at a higher range, and you're right. It's probably a remnant of history that we've been making those cuts at that levels, but a large chunk of the voters are coming in at that 80,000 or more level, especially along the coast. Obviously, it's a representative sample, so that's what you'd expect. We could have looked at even higher categories, and it's a good suggestion. I'll probably take that advice in future polls. Regarding other questions, we're showing you what we have. These were the questions that Jack and I put together. Again, we started this process about 2 months ago. A lot has happened in the past few weeks with proposals from the governor's office about suggestions on the deficit. The primary purpose of this poll was not so much solving or how the voters are viewing the deficit and what they would tolerate. It was mainly a view of Prop 13 on its anniversary and some general measures of taxes to update some trends and to get a little flavor of the deficit and some possible ways to resolve it. But you know, if we were designing a questionnaire again today, we'd probably include a number of other new questions. Ma'am.
Well, basically, that was what I was going to ask you. If you had used the word large corporation instead of commercial or large corporation who doesn't get an increase, you think that would have made a difference?
Yeah, in polling, we try to avoid phrases that arouse passion or, you know, are polarizing. So large corporations might have that characteristic. So I, as a pollster, avoid those words on both sides. So I'm trying to just get a general sense while describing to voters what it is I'm talking about, but I'm trying to avoid value statements as I make a description. But you're right, if I asked about large corporations, I bet we'd get higher levels of support. But is that fair? I don't know.
That question was framed to replicate the standard proposal for split roll property taxes. And the standard proposal doesn't say Chevron alone. It says, you know, commercial and rental.
Yes, sir.
I noticed on the overhead that everybody saw that there's an inconsistency in Table 7.
7B, right. In the printed copy, we spotted an error, and I was able to correct it here, if
Okay.
that's what you're looking at.
So it is 34 and
It is
27.
exactly as I presented it here. It hit the press before Jack spotted the error. And sorry, if you look at Table 7B under the statewide line, the numbers that are in the bar are incorrect. I apologize for that. It was
You didn't annotate it in your presentation, but you did correct it on your slide.
I corrected it on my overhead since I could
Right.
do that today, but I couldn't correct the printed version. I'm sorry.
The point was just the annotation, which you could have announced that wasn't a difference.
Okay. Well-
But from the standpoint of what's left out of the much too much, somewhat high, and what was left out? Too low or?
About right. And in this version of the question, it's interesting that sometimes in the past, I think in 2 or 3 of the trendline questions, the category too low was included as a fourth option, which usually only gets about a 2% or so proportion. It's very tiny. But in this version that we were working with Jack on, we didn't even offer too low. They could have volunteered that, but it wasn't read as an option. It was 3 categories: much too high, somewhat high, or about right. Okay? But it really doesn't affect the trend line all that much when we've included too low. Yes?
Hi. Along the lines of sort of responses being driven by what the choices are, obviously, on the question that you did on handling the deficit mostly through taxes or mostly through spending cuts, there's a lot of data from other surveys where people also have the choice of a combination of spending cuts and tax increases that actually shows majority support for the combination.
Sure.
And interestingly enough, Republicans tend not to be consistent. Republican women are much more open to that than Republican men are, for example.
Right.
So,
but still, you have to admit the word mostly. We're not saying solely through spending cuts and solely through tax increases. We're saying mostly. So from the public's perspective, they would want a majority of the deficit reduction to come out of spending cuts. At least that's my feel of the way we were wording it, and you can just see the biases of that from the results that we're getting. But you're right. I think the public, especially when you look at the question, in the end, do you think taxes will have to be increased to solve this massive deficit? Most voters pretty much are saying, yeah, even though they don't like that idea. I mean, voters, the analyses and the books that have been written on this, voters want it both ways. They want the services. They believe that they can still get these services even after the government does away with this deficit somehow. And they don't want to, and they don't support, if you don't go to voters and ask them anyways to support a tax increase. Voters are not going to show you the light in how to resolve this, because they fundamentally want it both ways, and that's my read of public opinion. So it's a tough issue for politicians and policymakers to grapple with, because there's no clear path that the public shows in how we should handle this, at least from the data that we're seeing here.
But you could also view the combination of these results as sort of indicating something that we know exists, which is a kind of a deep-seated cynicism about the politicians in the general public, because on the one hand they say, well, I would rather they didn't increase taxes. On the other hand, they say they could take care of most of this problem without doing it anyway. And on the third hand, that they say, but in the end, they're going to screw us anyway, right? So.
Hey, I know you said that basically what you presented on the screen is what you have, but I wanted to know if you had done any disaggregations by race, age, and urban versus rural. Because, I mean, you would see as well that a lot of lower-income people of color in the center of the cities would see that they don't get as much return in their services for their taxes. And the same with in rural areas. So that would have been a useful, I mean, especially because the demographics of California are changing, such that there's a lot more people of color. It would be interesting just to foreshadow what the support for Prop 13 would be in the future when we specifically target those that will soon be the majority, specifically Latinos and Asians. So.
We certainly have the capability in every survey that we do to analyze the data in many ways. The ethnic and race of the voter, the age of the voter, the geographic region of the voter, that's all in the data set. Unfortunately, for time purposes, I can't go through all of it. One thing I will say about race and ethnicity, one of the bigger areas of difference between white non-Hispanic voters and Latino and African American voters, for example, has to do with the question of government services. Should the government, state and local governments, provide more or fewer services to the public? When you ask, and then you ask that without the reference to taxes, as you will recall, it was supported 2-to-1. White non-Hispanics support just a narrow majority, say more government services, 51%. But if you ask that of Latinos and blacks, 84%, they want an expanded government. So certainly the views of ethnic voters differ from white non-Hispanics when it comes to government services. And then when you pose it in the way of more services, even if it means raising your taxes, or fewer services, even if this means that your taxes and fees will be kept at or below current levels, the support remains for more government among Latinos and majorities of Latinos and African Americans, but not among white non-Hispanics. So there are big differences in the data, and when we turn over the data file, we're all field poll data files since 1958. This is another wonderful relationship that we have with UC, are archived at the Survey Research Center. And so Jack and his colleagues will be poring over this data once we deliver this file. Usually it's a couple of months after the completion of the survey, and it's there for all UC researchers, and you can go back to the Prop 13 era and mine all of the data from the field poll back then, or even further back. Again, since 1958, all the data are here. Yes.
I want to defend the voters and their rationality just this once. And that is, you don't, except for the one question about commercial property, give them an option to say that the taxes ought to be increased on the commercial, industrial sector or on higher income individuals, anything to bring us back to the blend of taxes that we had during happier fiscal times. And I think given that we had a better mix at one time, and property changing hands under corporate structures has the option to play all sorts of games with Prop 13 that homeowners don't, so it skews things quite a bit in this state. It's not fair to say that they're not being logical. I think intuitive they know they're paying enough, but you need to give them the opportunity to comment.
Well, let me just respond because I'm a little bit constrained, and I think Jack is aware of this, is that the presentation and the discussion today, again, is mostly about Prop 13 and the general measures on taxation that the field poll has been tracking. I have to say also, however, that the field poll will be releasing another story. You see, we're a media news source, and it will have a little more detail from other questions. Some of the questions here are in that story, but there are a few questions where we're asking in a trend line way preferences of various types of taxes. And as you might suspect, there are a couple categories of taxing business property or taxing business income that get certain levels of support. We have the alcohol tax, the tobacco tax, the sales tax, all the common suspects are there. But unfortunately, I can't release those until Monday for Tuesday's newspaper. I'm under constraints. But read your newspapers, that they're supporting the poll. And I am grateful to the Chronicle and the Sacramento Bee and the others who allow the poll to continue over all these years. Yes, sir.
I'm Bill Fischel. I'm actually on a panel later. I think the Serrano decision had something to do with Prop 13. But I won't be able to tell it from any of the questions that you asked. The question that you need to ask next time you do a poll like this is to ask people whether they would be willing to modify Prop 13 and allow local property tax increases if they were earmarked for local schools. There is evidence out there that people think very differently about education at a statewide level versus the local level, and I think that's a question that needs to get on a poll sometime or another.
Well, we get a hint of that back here. Would you be willing to pay an additional $100 or $200 per year in taxes if this meant, you could reduce? Okay.
I think that we need to take a few minutes break here to set up the next panel. So we'll make that the last question. I'm sure there are many others. And Mark may be around to take one-on-one questions for a bit. So thank you very much.